The early October morning had arrived brittle and grey, draped in a kind of silence that made the back streets of Belmore feel older than they were. Elise Vaughan, 37, tugged her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she stepped into the driveway behind the small row house she rented, her takeaway coffee already cooling in her hand. The faded blue Corolla stood exactly where she'd left it last night, nose slightly crooked in the gravel. She opened the driver's door and slid in, shifting the coffee to the cup holder. As she turned the ignition, the familiar cough and sputter of her decade-old engine started up. But something else stirred, a sound she couldn't place. A soft, irregular thud. It came again. Then again, faint, rustling, followed by a high, breathy mewl. She froze. The mule wasn't outside. It was inside the car. She turned the ignition off. Her heartbeat filled the silence. Slowly, Elise leaned toward the passenger seat, then down. The sound came from deeper. She got out, crouched by the front passenger door, and opened it cautiously. That's when she heard it again, directly under the seat, a low, desperate cry. Elise slid to her knees and peered into the narrow, shadowed space beneath the passenger seat. Her eyes adjusted slowly, and there, huddled and trembling in the deepest corner, were eyes. 3 pairs. Kittens. She drew in a breath too fast. Not just 1. 3. They were pressed against one another, tiny backs arched, fur dusty and matted. One of them made a weak, rasping sound that ended in a whimper. The smallest one didn't move at all. Elise didn't move either, not for several seconds. It didn't make sense. The windows had been shut all night. There was no broken glass, no torn upholstery. She glanced toward the hood. She hadn't driven in 2 days. Still, how? She backed out slowly and popped the passenger door wide, kneeling again to take a closer look. The kittens shrank back instinctively. The tiniest of them, barely larger than a hand, was visibly struggling to breathe, sides heaving, eyes crusted shut. Elise's breath hitched. Her fingers hovered just above them. Then she saw it, scratches along the rubber lining of the passenger door, a streak of paw prints on the edge of the floor mat. Faint, but there. They hadn't been put here. They'd come inside themselves. The local vet, Dr. Reyes, was only a 10-minute drive away, but Elise couldn't bring herself to grab them bare-handed, not with how fragile they looked. She returned with an old towel, laid it open beside the car, and after a long, delicate process, full of whispered apologies and flinching movements, she managed to coax the smallest one out first. It went limp in her palm. The other 2 hissed and squirmed, but they didn't run. She wrapped them all carefully and slid into the driver's seat, holding the bundle close to her chest. The warmth of their small, shivering bodies pulsed through the towel like a second heartbeat. Dr. Reyes didn't ask many questions. He knew Elise vaguely, from town boards and mutual acquaintances. She waited outside the exam room, fingers curled around a styrofoam cup of coffee she didn't drink. Every few minutes, she'd glance at the back hallway, waiting for the door to creak open. When it did, Dr. Reyes didn't smile. 2 are dehydrated, underfed, he said, scratching his neck. But manageable. The 3rd, he paused. She's critical, might have pneumonia. Her gums are pale, breathing shallow. We're running fluids now, but it's not guaranteed. Elise nodded slowly, like the words were pebbles dropping into a deep well. Will she be in pain? She is, he said gently, but we're giving her warmth, oxygen, and IV support. The next 12 hours are everything." Back at her house, Elise sat on the back step as dusk slid down over Belmore like a soft blanket. The town was quiet, just the hush of wind through power lines and a lone truck pulling into the gas station down the block. The remaining 2 kittens slept in a lined crate near her feet, curled around each other. They hadn't eaten much, barely sniffed the wet food she'd offered. She stared at the Corolla, the passenger door still ajar, the towel she'd used crumpled on the sidewalk. And for the first time that day, she let herself ask why. Why her car? Why those kittens? She went inside and opened her laptop, searching local news. That's when she found the story. 3 days earlier, a stray tabby had been hit by a delivery van 2 blocks from her street. A woman named Marlene had tried to move the body, but had found it too late. The article mentioned the cat had been seen several times with kittens. Animal control had searched nearby sheds and garbage bins, but no kittens were ever found. Until now. They must have followed their mother's scent, wandered close enough to the street, and in panic or hunger, slipped into Elise's open-engine bay through the undercarriage. They'd ridden silent in her unused car. Waiting. And now, their mother was gone. She looked again at the crate, at the tiny breathing shapes curled in exhaustion. They had nowhere else left to go. By midnight, Elise was back at the clinic. The smallest kitten had taken a downturn, Dr. Reyes had said. She stood by the incubator, watching the tiny rise and fall of its chest. One paw twitched now and then, as though dreaming. She raised her hand, hesitated, then laid her fingers lightly against the glass. "I didn't even want a pet," she whispered. The kitten didn't move. But for the first time in years, Elise felt something she hadn't expected. Not just sorrow, but purpose. Like something broken in her life had paused, waiting, and somehow begun to breathe again. The morning came without color. Thin light drifted through the blinds of Elise's kitchen, painting long grey streaks across the laminate floor. Her coffee had gone cold again. She stood barefoot at the counter, staring at the phone. It hadn't rung. No updates from Dr. Reyes. She rubbed at her eyes with the heel of her hand. The night had passed in fragments, waking to the smallest sounds from the crate in the corner, checking the kittens every few hours, adjusting the blanket like it mattered. One of them, the bolder one with the uneven black stripe on its back, had started to crawl out toward her during the night. No hissing now, just quiet observation, like it was watching her grieve something it recognized. By noon, Elise was at the clinic again. The receptionist met her with a small nod and ushered her back without words. The smallest kitten, barely hanging on last night, had improved. Not by much, but enough. She was out of the incubator now, a tiny tube still taped to her foreleg, sleeping in a folded towel beside a ceramic heating pad. Elise lowered herself into the plastic chair across from the kennel and just watched her. Her name was just a code on the clipboard. F3. Elise stared at it, then gently took the clipboard and wrote something else. Juniper. Back home, the other 2 kittens began to open up in quiet ways. The black-striped one started exploring the floor around the crate with slow, wobbling confidence. The slightly fluffier sibling, grey with a tan chest and hauntingly large eyes, was more cautious, but both began responding to her voice, not with affection, but with a certain trust. A pause. a blink. On the third night, Elise left the crate door open, just to see. They didn't run. They stayed curled on the blanket, staring out, blinking slowly when she moved nearby. She sat on the floor, legs crossed, and read aloud, an old habit from years ago when her house had felt less empty. Just a book of short essays she didn't even care about. But the sound seemed to ground the room, and the kittens listened. Dr. Reyes called again the next day. "Juniper's still fragile, but there's progress," he said. "She responds to heat now. No more cyanosis." Elise closed her eyes. "Can I bring her siblings?" He paused. "Are you sure?" "No, but it feels wrong not to." That afternoon, Elise arrived at the clinic with both kittens in a canvas carrier. As soon as the siblings were placed gently beside the recovering Juniper in the padded pen, something shifted. The black-striped one crawled forward immediately, pressing its head against Juniper's side. The grey one followed, curling around her legs. Juniper twitched at first, then stilled. Dr. Reyes watched silently, then stepped away to give them space. Elise didn't move. She sat on the bench across the room, hands in her lap, watching the three tiny forms melt into one another like liquid shadow. The following days blurred. Juniper was sent home under strict instructions: medication, temperature control, isolated feeding. Elise converted her spare bathroom into a makeshift recovery room, lining it with towels, heating pads, and a diffuser to help her breathe easier. She didn't know when it had happened, but the boundaries of her life, the quiet, clockwork routine of solitude, had already shifted. Work emails waited longer, dishes piled. Her evenings were filled with watching the kittens, brushing their fur, changing bedding. She learned their cries, their tiny postures. When Juniper's appetite returned, timid licks from a dropper, Elise cried without sound. That night, the kittens all slept in her bedroom. She'd meant to keep them in the crate, but sometime after midnight, she woke to a soft weight against her ankle. They had climbed out, all three curled on the end of the bed like they'd always belonged there. 2 weeks passed, and then something she didn't expect happened. She received a call from the local shelter, the Belmore Animal Refuge. Elise had posted anonymously about the kittens in a neighborhood forum, and someone had forwarded it. A volunteer named Kendra wanted to see them. "They're not ready for adoption," Elise said, hesitant. "We don't want to separate them," Kendra assured her. "Actually, that's why I'm calling." Elise frowned. "Why?" Kendra hesitated. "We've had an unusual event here. A stray came in, older female, recently weaned kittens. She's been refusing food, lethargic. We tried socializing her with other cats. Nothing. Until..." Elise waited. "We brought in a new litter, just for exposure therapy. One of them looked like your Juniper. The female immediately perked up, started grooming her." Elise blinked. "You think she's..." "We don't know. Could be coincidence, but the behavior was maternal." That weekend, Elise drove to the shelter with the kittens in tow. The building was clean, modest, smelling faintly of antiseptic and old fleece. Kendra greeted her with a warm nod and led her to the back room. The female cat, a dilute calico with amber eyes, lay curled in the corner of her enclosure, unmoving. Elise placed the carrier down and opened the flap. Juniper stepped out first. The calico lifted her head slowly. Their eyes met. What followed was not dramatic. No rushing. No dramatic meows. Juniper walked slowly to the cat's side, hesitated, then nestled her tiny face under the cat's chin. The calico let out a sound, half sigh, half purr, and began to groom her. They didn't test DNA. They didn't need to. Over the next hour, the calico accepted all 3 kittens without hesitation. She curled around them like she'd been waiting, her body folding naturally into the protective shape of motherhood. One by one, the kittens pressed in. And then something even more unexpected happened. The calico rolled slightly, exposing her belly. Juniper latched first, then the others. "She's feeding them?" Elise asked, stunned. "She hasn't had milk in days," Kendra whispered. This shouldn't even be possible." But it was. By the time Elise left, the room had gone quiet. 4 bodies in one corner. No separation, no hesitation. Just something ancient, recognizing itself. Elise hadn't planned to go back the next morning, but by noon, she was standing at the gates of the Belmore Animal Refuge again, coffee in hand, the chill of late autumn stinging her fingers. She wasn't sure what had pulled her there. Some quiet thread of guilt, or maybe the kind of worry that only grows in silence. Kendra greeted her with a knowing smile. "You're not the only one who's checked in already. We've had 2 adoption offers for the calico and her miracle kittens." Elise forced a polite nod. "Are you considering them?" "No," Kendra said simply. "Not yet." The shelter was calm that day. Low-foot traffic, quiet halls. When Elise entered the enclosure, the scene was nearly identical to the one she'd left. The calico curled around the 3 kittens, a rhythm of slow, steady breathing. Juniper was tucked beneath her chest like a heartbeat. She watched them sleep, her hands still at her sides, not daring to interrupt. The calico lifted her head slightly, gave Elise a brief, searching glance, then rested it back on her paws. A flicker of trust, a trace of memory. They began calling the calico Mara, short for Marantha, a name Kendra said meant beloved. She wasn't a young cat. The vet guessed maybe 6 years. Her body had known litters before, and something about her posture still carried the wear of a life lived mostly on pavement. But around the kittens, she moved like something rewound, her bones lighter, her eyes watchful but serene. She bathed them constantly. If one cried, she rose before a staff member could even reach the pen. Elise witnessed her lift Juniper by the scruff gently, placing her in the warmth of her belly. Once the black-striped one meowed toward the gate when Elise entered. Mara turned, blinked at Elise again, and gave a soft, warning chirp. Not yet. Not your place. And Elise understood. This was no longer a rescue. It was a reunion. Still, the question lingered. What now? They couldn't live in a shelter enclosure forever. Adoption meant splitting them up. The kittens might adapt, yes. But Mara? She had nearly shut down before they arrived. When Elise raised the concern with Kendra, she nodded slowly. We've seen this before. Pairs, sometimes trios. But this is more than behavioral attachment. It's biological or emotional. Hard to say. If they go, they need to go together. Elise hesitated. That narrows the pool. Not many homes can take 4 cats. Kendra smiled faintly. That's why we haven't rushed it. For the next week, Elise visited daily. She brought sardine treats, clean blankets, toys. Anything to ease their time. But more than that, she just watched. Mara's head lifting every time Juniper stirred. The kittens learning to climb over her sides, tumbling in slow, clumsy somersaults. Their wildness, so recently born of panic, now melted into play. One afternoon, Elise brought a crate lined with a fleece hoodie from her bed. She set it down and sat beside it. Mara stared. The kittens came first. Black Stripe leapt into the crate and immediately began rolling in the fabric, purring loudly. Grey Eyes followed, less bold, but curious. Juniper didn't move, but Mara did. She stood slowly, stretched, then stepped forward and pressed her nose to the crate's edge. Her body brushed Elise's arm. It wasn't accidental. It was permission. That night, Elise didn't sleep. She lay awake, the ceiling fan clicking softly, the silence of her home suddenly louder than usual. She thought of her old apartment in the city, the one she'd left behind after her divorce. How she'd given up trying to fill the space with things, throw pillows, houseplants, half-started hobbies. None of it had mattered, nothing had stayed. But these kittens hadn't just arrived. They had chosen her. Broken, terrified, half-starved. And they'd found her. And now their mother, who by all logic should have been lost to grief, had returned, not just to survive, but to nurture. Elise sat up in the dark and whispered aloud to the still room. "Why not me?" 2 days later, she returned to the shelter with paperwork in hand. Kendra didn't hide her smile. "You're sure?" "No," Elise said honestly, "but I think they are." The adoption process was longer than usual. Special considerations, a home visit, bonding sessions. Elise bought supplies she never thought she'd need: climbing shelves, slow feeders, corner hammocks. The spare bathroom became a full recovery suite. She moved her office setup into the living room to give them more space. On the final morning, as she arrived to bring them home, Mara was waiting at the gate, awake, alert. Not a sound, just watching. Elise crouched low, letting the crate door swing open. The kittens burst in first, wrestling across the blanket like they'd been gone for years. Mara followed last. With calm steps, she climbed in and lay down in the center. The kittens curled against her instantly. Elise sat down beside them on the tile floor, blinking quickly, her throat tight. No fanfare, no music swelling, just something whole. Resting again. Elise had underestimated what it meant to bring them home. The first 3 days were quiet, almost deceptively so. The kittens settled in as if they'd been waiting for it. The couch became a racetrack, the windowsill their hunting perch. Mara adjusted, slowly but unmistakably. She slept curled around them on the faded wool rug Elise had inherited from her mother, her eyes half closed, tail twitching with contentment. But on the 4th night, just past 1 in the morning, something shifted. Juniper woke Elise first. A soft, scratchy cry from the hallway outside her bedroom. Not her usual mewl for food. This one had urgency. Elise sat up, blinked into the dim light pouring from the cracked door. The house was quiet. No movement, just the distant hum of the refrigerator and the rain tapping the window panes. Juniper mewed again, this time louder. Then came the others, a scuffle of paws. Elise stepped into the hallway and found all 3 kittens pacing outside the bathroom door. It was closed. She hadn't closed it. Inside there was a sound, a soft thud. Then silence. Elise's chest tightened. "Mara!" She pushed open the door. The room was dark, save for the nightlight plugged into the wall. Mara was collapsed beside the litter box, breathing, but barely. At the emergency vet, time became fractured. Paperwork, whispered questions, a technician carrying Mara's limp body through the swinging doors. Elise waited in a windowless room under fluorescent lights that made everything feel harsher than it was. The kittens had been left behind, locked safely in their carrier beside her. Juniper sat pressed against the mesh, silent. Dr. Reyes arrived in person 20 minutes later. "She's not dying," he said gently, lowering himself into the chair across from Elise. "But it's serious. High fever, early signs of sepsis. Could be a ruptured infection. We're starting IV antibiotics and running blood work now." Elise swallowed. But she was fine. Dr. Reyes looked at her with tired eyes. Mother cats often hide pain until it's too late, especially ones who've lived feral. Their bodies give everything they have to their litters, and sometimes that means they ignore themselves completely. Elise blinked back tears. "Can I see her?" He nodded. Mara lay beneath a thin blanket, her body lined with tubes, her breathing shallow, her paws twitched, not in pain, but like she was running, even in sleep. Elise didn't touch her. She sat beside her, eyes focused on the slow rhythm of her chest, and whispered, "You've done more than enough. Let them take care of you now." Back home, the kittens were unsettled. They paced, cried, meowed in the way only motherless kittens meow, sharp, constant, searching. Elise lay on the floor with them that night, letting their tiny bodies crawl across her legs, up her sides, into the crook of her arm. They didn't sleep. Neither did she. The next morning, she took them back to the clinic, not just for support, but because she wasn't willing to let them spend another second wondering where their world had gone. Juniper was the first to recognize Mara's scent. As Elise lowered her near the oxygen pen, she stopped crying, then crawled forward, her tiny claws gripping the edge of the blanket. Mara lifted her head slightly, just enough to see. And for the first time in nearly 18 hours, she purred. It was faint, rough, but unmistakable. Juniper curled beside her without waiting for permission. The others followed. And something changed. Over the next 48 hours, Mara improved. The infection responded to antibiotics, her appetite returned in fragments, and her blood work stabilized. Dr. Reyes called it a maternal miracle, shaking his head with a tired smile. But Elise knew better. It wasn't medicine alone. It was the presence of those kittens, their warmth, their smell, their silent insistence, that had pulled Mara back. And it hit Elise, in that small vet room with the 2 white walls, that this was more than a rescue story. It was a survival bond, a truth older than science. A week later, Elise brought them all home again. The house felt different, not just fuller, but connected. The kittens no longer followed her from room to room. They followed each other. Their games grew more confident, their cries less desperate. They bathed one another, chased shadows, curled together by the radiator in long, tangled spirals. And Mara? She wasn't the same cat who'd collapsed on that bathroom floor. She was slower now, more cautious. But her gaze followed Elise, not with suspicion, but familiarity. One evening, as Elise lay reading on the couch, Juniper climbed into her lap and stayed. Minutes later, Mara followed. She didn't curl around the kitten. She curled around Elise, head on her thigh, eyes closed. Elise didn't move for an hour. She just sat there, still, tears warming her cheeks. Not because she was sad, but because she'd finally been chosen back. Snow didn't come often to Belmore, but when it did, it arrived softly. It had been 6 weeks since Mara's collapse, 2 since her final antibiotic dose, 3 days since Elise noticed Juniper purring without needing to be touched first. And that morning, Elise stood at her front window with a cup of warm tea, watching the slow hush of flakes gather on the edges of the street. The town was barely moving, just the distant sound of a shovel scraping pavement 2 doors down. Her house, once eerily quiet, now echoed faintly with life. A scatter of paws across the hardwood, a faint mewl from the hallway, the thump of a kitten misjudging a leap and landing squarely in a basket of laundry. They had made a life here, and it had made one in her. The adoption paperwork had long since been finalized. Elise had even framed it, not for sentiment but as proof to herself. You followed through. The kittens were vaccinated, microchipped, and growing fast. Black Stripe, now nicknamed Nell, had developed a habit of dragging socks into odd corners of the house like trophies. The grey-eyed one, who never took to a name, so Elise simply called her Little, had claimed the kitchen window ledge as her throne. And Juniper had become her shadow. Wherever Elise moved, Juniper trailed. Not needy, just present. She'd sit quietly on the table as Elise worked from home, or curl behind her knees at night, warm and silent. She was still small for her age, still breathed a little heavier on cold mornings, but her eyes were bright and her body stronger with every week. Sometimes Elise still woke in the dark and reached out instinctively to check her breathing. She always was. Mara had found her place, too. No longer just mother, though she still curled protectively when the kittens fell asleep together, but something steadier, a quiet watcher, a cat who chose her moments carefully. Most evenings, she lay in the corner of Elise's study, paws tucked under her chest, gaze settled just so. She didn't demand affection, but if Elise was still, long enough, quiet enough, she'd come. One night during a thunderstorm, Mara leapt onto the couch uninvited and curled beside Elise with her face pressed gently into her side. Elise didn't breathe for a moment. Then she exhaled, and everything inside her loosened. There were still days Elise didn't speak much, days the silence of her past rose again, memories of a house full of noise that eventually went still, a marriage that dissolved in muted exits, a life that once felt predictable, until it wasn't. But now, that silence no longer frightened her. It was shared, occupied, mended. The local shelter reached out again, this time not to reclaim, but to invite. Kendra wanted to know if Elise would consider volunteering on weekends, maybe even fostering, when the time felt right. Elise smiled when she read the message. She didn't answer right away. Later that week, she visited the shelter, not to volunteer, but to bring something. A crate. Inside it, a box of toys, several bags of dry food, 2 heated pads, and a soft grey hoodie, the same one she'd once used to line the carrier. As she left the crate with Kendra, Elise glanced into the holding room one last time. A mother cat, thin, eyes cautious, was curled around 2 newborns in the corner, and Elise felt it again. That pause, that ache, that invisible thread between past and present. She left quietly, but she knew she'd be back. That night, as she sat by the window watching the streetlights blink over the new snow, Elise felt a soft weight land on her shoulder. Juniper. She'd never done that before. Elise turned slightly and found the kitten balanced perfectly, paws dug gently into her sweater, eyes wide with stillness. A second later, Nell followed, tumbling onto the couch and curling into her lap. Little took her usual post in the windowsill, and Mara, late as always, emerged from the hallway and jumped up beside Elise, stretching out with regal ease. No meows, no ceremony. just presence. Elise leaned back against the couch, hand resting gently on Mara's back. Juniper pressed warm to her neck. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like something was missing. She felt home, whole, chosen. And in a quiet house that once echoed only with absence, 4 forgotten lives rewrote the meaning of love, one poor step at a time.